There's a reason the Bible is one of the most studied books in history. For billions of people, it is the ultimate authority on morality, meaning, and truth. But for just as long as it has been revered, it has also been questioned. And one of the most persistent questions has always been this: if the Bible is the word of an all-knowing, perfect deity, why does it contain contradictions? Not minor disagreements, but major, irreconcilable statements that go far beyond interpretation. Now let's be clear. Every large text is bound to have small inconsistencies. That's normal when multiple writers contribute across centuries. But the Bible isn't presented as just a human effort. It is claimed to be divinely inspired, flawless in essence. That's what makes contradictions so striking, because if perfection exists anywhere, it should exist here. The contradictions begin right at the start. Genesis gives us two creation stories, not one. In the first, God creates animals, then man and woman together. In the second, man comes first, then animals, then woman. This isn't a subtle difference, it's a reversal of sequence. Scholars have argued about this for centuries, but the simplest explanation is that these were two separate traditions woven together, and if that's the case, it means the foundation of the text is a human patchwork, not a seamless divine design. But it doesn't stop there. Take the question of God's nature. In some passages, God is merciful, slow to anger, forgiving. In others, he wipes out entire populations, orders genocide, and punishes children for the sins of their parents. These are not just different moods, they are different moral systems. One God says, "Love your neighbor," another sends plagues for disobedience. If morality comes from a perfect source, why does it swing so wildly? Then there's the matter of laws. In Exodus, the 10 Commandments prohibit killing, but just a few chapters later, God commands the Israelites to slaughter men, women, and children in Canaan. How do you reconcile "thou shalt not kill" with "now go kill in my name"? Apologists call these special cases acts of justice, but when you look at the text, the language doesn't suggest reluctant punishment. It reads like holy war. The contradictions aren't just in ethics, they're in facts. Consider the accounts of Jesus' resurrection. One gospel says the women found the tomb empty at dawn. Another says it was still dark. One says they saw an angel inside the tomb. Another says they saw 2 angels outside. Some say they ran and told the disciples immediately. Others say they told no one because they were afraid. These details matter because the resurrection is the cornerstone of Christian faith. If the central event is described in conflicting ways, what does that say about reliability? Genealogies pose another puzzle. Matthew traces Jesus' lineage through David to Joseph in one order, while Luke gives a completely different list of names. Apologists argue about legal versus biological lines, but even that explanation collapses when you realize both lists can't be literally true. And if accuracy wasn't a concern, why include the lists at all? Prophecies are another area where contradictions surface. Isaiah predicts that nations shall beat their swords into plowshares. Joel predicts the opposite. They'll beat plowshares into swords. Which is it? Eternal peace or endless war? Both can't happen, yet both are presented as God's word. And then there's the promise that the meek shall inherit the earth. That sounds comforting, until you read texts celebrating violent conquest as divinely ordained. Even the portrayal of Jesus shifts dramatically. In John, he declares his divinity openly, "I and the Father are one." In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he is far more reserved, often speaking in riddles and parables. Did he announce his identity plainly or hide it in metaphor? The difference isn't trivial. It shapes the entire doctrine of who Jesus was. And what about salvation? Paul says we are justified by faith alone. James insists faith without works is dead. Entire denominations have split over this contradiction, because it isn't just semantic, it's foundational. Is redemption about belief or behavior? The text says both, and believers have been arguing about it for 2 millennia. These contradictions aren't just academic curiosities, they affect real lives. They fuel divisions, wars, and cultural battles because people cling to different verses as ultimate truth. And when those verses collide, conflict is inevitable. The deeper question, though, is why contradictions exist at all in a text claimed to be perfect. If God authored it, why include multiple timelines, conflicting genealogies, contradictory moral laws? Some defenders say the apparent contradictions are illusions, that deeper study resolves them. But the resolutions often stretch language and logic so far that they create new problems. When a plain reading requires layers of reinterpretation, something is off. And these are just surface-level contradictions. When you dig into theology, the tensions grow sharper. Free will versus divine predestination, God's justice versus his mercy, the claim of an unchanging deity who changes his covenants multiple times. These aren't small wrinkles, they're structural fractures. The pattern suggests something important. The Bible wasn't written as a single, unified book. It was stitched together from oral traditions, regional myths, political agendas, and evolving theologies. That's why it contains multiple voices, often in conflict. And if that's true, then calling it infallible isn't just misleading, it erases the very human fingerprints all over its pages. In the next section, we'll go even deeper. We'll explore contradictions in law codes, historical events that never happened, and moral commands that clash not just with logic, but with each other. When we move beyond creation and resurrection accounts, contradictions start appearing in the historical narratives themselves. Take the story of David's census. In 2 Samuel, it says God incited David to take a census of Israel. In 1 Chronicles, the same event is blamed on Satan. This isn't a minor detail. It changes the moral tone completely. Was the census God's idea or the devil's? Did God punish David for obeying him, or did David succumb to evil influence? These questions cut deep because they challenge the consistency of divine justice itself. Now look at Noah's Ark. One text says Noah took 2 of every kind of animal. Another says 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 of unclean. Which is correct, and why does it matter? Because these contradictions suggest multiple sources were spliced together without harmonization. You see the same phenomenon in flood timelines. Did the waters prevail for 40 days, or did they last 150? If these accounts were dictated by an omniscient mind, why can't they agree on basic numbers? The 10 Commandments present another glaring issue. Most people think they know them. Don't steal, don't kill, honor your parents. But if you read Exodus and Deuteronomy closely, the commandments differ in wording and emphasis. One says keep the Sabbath because God rested after creation. The other says keep it because of liberation from Egypt. Which is the real reason? Both can't be original unless God contradicts himself. Numbers are a recurring problem. In 2 Samuel, one passage claims 800,000 soldiers fought for Israel, while another says 1.1 million. That's not a typo, it's a difference of 300,000 troops. Then there's the Age of Kings. How old was Jehoiachin when he began to reign? One verse says 8, another says 18. These aren't symbolic numbers, they're historical details. If the text can't maintain consistency here, what does that say about claims of absolute reliability? And what about the crucifixion? One gospel records Jesus carrying his cross all the way to Golgotha. Another says Simon of Cyrene carried it for him. Was Jesus strong enough or not? Did darkness cover the land or not? Did the temple veil tear before or after his death? Even his final words differ. It is finished in John, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" in Matthew and Mark. And Father, into your hands I commit my spirit in Luke. These aren't stylistic variations. They present fundamentally different portraits of the same moment. The contradictions even extend to God's knowledge. In some passages, God knows everything from the beginning of time. In others, he tests people to see what they will do. Why test if the outcome is already known? Did God regret creating humans as Genesis claims, or does he never change his mind, as Numbers declares. These questions reveal cracks in the claim of divine immutability. Then there's the problem of moral evolution. Early texts condone slavery, endorse polygamy, and prescribe death for minor offenses like picking up sticks on the Sabbath. Later texts move away from these practices, or at least downplay them. Apologists say this is progressive revelation, but that raises its own contradiction. If God's law is perfect, why does it need gradual upgrades? Perfection shouldn't require patches like flawed software. Consider dietary laws. Leviticus forbids eating shellfish and pork. The New Testament in Acts seems to abolish these restrictions after Peter's vision. So, were these foods inherently unclean or not? If morality comes from divine command, why does morality change? And if it changes, can it ever claim absolute authority? The real answer to that question rises from a determinism, the challenge of a world so hot and people so weak that Pharaoh's acts, prophecies, also pose puzzles. In Ezekiel, God promises Nebuchadnezzar will conquer Tyre completely. History tells us he didn't. Scholars try to salvage this by spiritualizing the text, but the plain reading failed. If prophecy can miss its mark, what does that say about the source? Even the message of salvation wavers. Jesus says the law remains until heaven and earth pass away. Paul says believers are no longer under the law. That's more than nuance. It's a contradiction about the entire covenant framework. Which is binding, law or grace? Entire denominations exist because this question has no consistent biblical answer. These examples matter because they reveal something about the nature of the text. They show a compilation of voices across time, shaped by culture and politics, sometimes harmonizing, often colliding. And those collisions didn't vanish. They were canonized. The result is a book that preaches love your enemy in one verse and commands annihilation in another. A book that claims an unchanging God yet records him reversing his own rules. Some say these tensions add richness, but let's be honest. Richness is not the same as reliability. If the foundation shifts beneath your feet, calling it solid doesn't make it so. And when people insist on that illusion of solidity, they don't just risk intellectual dishonesty. They risk moral chaos. Because if everything is God's will, even when statements contradict, then any act can be justified. History has proven this point again and again. In the final section, we'll explore why these contradictions persist in modern faith, how apologists attempt to reconcile them, and what these efforts reveal about the human need for certainty. When we examine the Bible's contradictions with honesty, a pattern emerges. They're not random errors. They're the fingerprints of history, the residue of a book shaped by human hands over centuries. Multiple authors, each with their own context, language, and worldview, contributed to these texts. Their stories reflect tribal struggles, cultural norms, political agendas, and personal beliefs. What we have today is not a single voice, but a choir of voices, sometimes harmonious, often discordant. Take the Old Testament. It grew from oral traditions long before it was written down. Those traditions evolved as tribes merged, as kingdoms rose and fell, as leaders sought legitimacy by framing laws as divine commands. That's why you see older warlike texts alongside later passages that emphasize peace and mercy. These shifts mirror the social changes of ancient Israel, not the decrees of an unchanging God. The New Testament follows a similar trajectory. Early Christians were scattered communities interpreting Jesus in different ways. Some saw him as a prophet, others as divine. Some emphasized Jewish law, others rejected it entirely. When these writings were collected, contradictions were inevitable. The fact that they remain is telling. Church leaders could have smoothed them out during canonization. They didn't. Perhaps because conflicting accounts served a purpose, they allowed flexibility, making the text adaptable to countless cultures and eras. This adaptability explains why the Bible has survived. but it also explains why it divides. When a single book says, "Turn the other cheek," and "an eye for an eye," people will always choose the verse that suits their needs. And when divine authority is claimed for both peace and violence, both forgiveness and vengeance, the result is chaos disguised as certainty. Modern believers often say contradictions don't matter because the message is consistent. But is it? If the message is love, why include so many commands to kill? If the message is truth, why preserve mutually exclusive accounts of the same events? To claim consistency in the face of contradiction isn't faith, it's denial. And denial has a cost. It teaches people to ignore evidence when it conflicts with cherished beliefs. That habit doesn't stay in religion. It spills into science, ethics, and politics, weakening our collective grasp on reality. Some try to resolve this tension by treating contradictions as metaphor. They say the Bible isn't meant to be literal, but symbolic. That approach softens the blow, but it raises a question. If everything is metaphor, who decides the meaning? If "kill every Amalekite" isn't literal, then is "love your neighbor" literal? When interpretation becomes subjective, the text loses authority, and perhaps that's the most honest outcome. Others lean on the claim that divine mystery explains everything, that God's ways are higher than ours, so contradictions are beyond our understanding, but that argument cuts both ways. If contradictions don't need reconciling because they're divine, then any book, any claim, can make the same excuse. Truth ceases to matter when mystery becomes a shield for inconsistency. The persistence of these contradictions into the modern era reveals something profound, not about God, but about us. We crave certainty in an uncertain world. We want a perfect book because perfection promises stability, and so we defend that illusion even when evidence tells a different story. We rewrite logic, stretch reason, and silence questions, all to preserve a sense of control. But what if we let go? What if we accept the Bible as what it is, a remarkable human document, not a divine dictation? Suddenly, the contradictions make sense. They're not flaws, they're clues. Clues that this book was born from struggle, not serenity. That it reflects humanity's evolving attempt to make sense of existence. And in that light, its value doesn't disappear, it transforms. Instead of being a final answer, it becomes a historical witness to our search for meaning. Contradictions then aren't just cracks in the foundation. They're windows into reality. They remind us that truth is not handed down fully formed, but discovered, debated, and refined. They challenge us to think critically, to weigh evidence, to resist the comfort of easy certainties. Because if the price of certainty is honesty, then certainty isn't worth paying for. So the next time someone says the Bible is perfect, remember the two creation stories, the conflicting genealogies, the contradictory commandments. Remember the shifting portraits of God, warrior and peacemaker, merciful and merciless. And ask yourself, if a book can't agree with itself, why should it rule anyone's life? Contradictions matter because they invite the question that faith fears most. What if we've been wrong? That question is uncomfortable, but it's also liberating, because only when we stop defending contradictions can we start searching for truth. Not in ancient texts that fight with themselves, but in evidence, reason, and the shared pursuit of understanding. That's not just an intellectual choice, it's a moral one, because honesty, unlike dogma, doesn't need to fear the light. And that is why contradictions in the Bible aren't a trivial issue. They're the clearest signal that what has been sold as absolute certainty is in fact a fragile construction. And once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? For those who value truth, the answer is simple. Keep questioning, keep thinking, and never mistake tradition for truth.